What is the nature of Roran and Katrina's relationship? Was it true love? Was it a healthy relationship? What made this relationship as strong as it is? Today, on this episode of the Inheritance Cycle Analyzed, we delve into the relationship between two of the most important characters in the inheritance cycle. Hello everyone, this is SaberRex, and in this video we will be covering the characters, creatures, and plots of books and films, such as the Primitive War franchise, the Inheritance Cycle, and so much more. So without further ado, welcome, one and all. Out of all the romantic relationships showcased in the inheritance cycle, whether major or minor, one of the most focused on in the series is that of Roran Garrison and Katrina Ismira's daughter. Throughout the 4 books of the inheritance cycle, that is to say, Aragon, Eldest, Brazinger, and Inheritance, the relationship between Roran and Katrina is one of the most touched upon and well developed in the story. In many ways, it is a quintessential love story between these two people. But what is it that makes this relationship work throughout the series? That is what we are going to explore with this analysis. And it starts by examining how these characters came to fall in love in the first place. According to Roran, he and Katrina were always partial to one another. He liked her, and she liked him back. However, the moment Roran knew that she was the right woman for him was a sweet and simple event by any means. When Katrina stopped by the side of the road in Carvajal to smell a moss rose, the smile this simple flower brought to her face was enough to capture Roran's heart. According to him, it was such a beautiful, simple smile that he wanted to continue to make Katrina smile like that from that point on until the day he died. This simple reason alone is enough to suggest that Roran's feelings for Katrina were indeed genuine. Over time, their love apparently blossomed, though they had to keep it secret for quite a while. From what we can interpret in the inheritance cycle, this relationship lasted a few years before Roran decided to propose. However, he was faced with a problem. In Carvajal, a man had to prove he was a worthy husband in order to provide for his future wife. Likewise, Katrina required a dowry to show that she would be a faithful and diligent wife for her future husband. This brings us to the first obstacle in Roran's path to being with Katrina. He was poor. While he and his father and his cousin Aragon owned a farm of their own, they often could not afford certain comforts of village life. Much of their money was made by harvesting grain, such as wheat, and even then, it wasn't worth much. While it is clear that Katrina did not mind this, her father did. Sloan Aldenson, the village butcher, looked down upon Roran for his status in the village as a farmer and being the poorest one in the valley, and intended to match Katrina to someone he felt was more suitable, believing she would be happier with a wealthier man to provide for her. Roran, however, would not be denied, and resolved himself to earn Sloane's blessing to marry his daughter by putting in as much hard work as he could and earning enough money to gain his respect. It was because of this that he decided to take the job at the mill run by Dempton in Therinsford as a means of increasing his income so that he could provide enough for Katrina. Roran's father, Garrow, genuinely approved of this, as he wanted to see the family grow and for Roran to be happy. However, when Garrow was murdered by the Razak and his cousin Aragon went chasing after his murderers, Roran was left grieving and desperate to find another way to provide for Katrina, since he now had no farm to his name and no job beyond working for his friend Horst, the village blacksmith. Though he promised to find a way to earn enough money to win Sloane's respect, Katrina warned him that every day he refused to propose to her was a day that Sloane would spend looking for another suitor to marry Katrina. Eventually, however, fate intervened and forced Roran's hand. When the Razak returned under the orders of King Galbatorix with armed soldiers looking for him so they could question Roran about his cousin's whereabouts, Roran was forced to take action. During what would later become known as the Battle of Carvajal, not long after the first part of the battle, Roran, steadfast in his desire to be with Katrina, secretly proposed to her and she accepted. Though he would have liked to have done it the proper way, the circumstances were already beyond his control, and he could only try to protect Katrina in whatever way he was capable of, which meant in this case fighting and getting her to safety away from the Imperial soldiers. Though she wanted to stay with him, Roran was able to get her to see reason, and convinced Katrina to get to safety by having her agree to hide in the mountains of the Spine with the rest of the women and children from the village so that they would be safe from the wrath of the soldiers. However, this was ultimately not to be. When Roran announced this plan to the village, Sloane went into a fit of maddened paranoia. Sloane had always feared the Spine ever since his wife, Ismira, Katrina's mother, had accidentally fallen to her death atop the Igualda Falls near the village. When he realized Katrina was going into the place that he feared most and had taken his wife from him, Sloane went into a fit of rage, exacerbated by her refusal to follow his orders. Roran tried to calm him down, but Sloane was beyond rational thinking. Desperate to stop the fight, Roran revealed that he had proposed to Katrina and that they were now engaged, but instead of accepting this, Sloane disinherited his daughter out of pride and humiliation. Roran justified that he had wanted to propose to her in the traditional manner, but also told the butcher that circumstances were beyond his control and that he had no other choice, reiterating that he genuinely loved Katrina. The argument eventually came to blows when Sloane refused to accept Roran as his future son-in-law, and Sloane quickly lost. The furious butcher refused to accept the engagement and disinherited his daughter, saying that she would have no dowry and labeling her as no relation of his own. A heartbroken Katrina was escorted away by her friends in the village. When questioned by Elaine, Horst's wife, Roran was steadfast in his love for Katrina. When questioned further, he said that he would do whatever he had to in order to provide for her, even if it meant starting with nothing, which was the position he was already in. If he failed, Katrina would become the village's only beggar and be left bitter and alone. Such was Roran's devotion to her that he was willing to accept whatever price was necessary in order to be with the woman he loved, desperate to make sure that this did not happen to her. Eventually, later that night, it is shown that Katrina visited Roran in bed and implied they slept together for the first time. Unbeknownst to them, however, Sloane had betrayed the entire village to the Razak, who snuck in later that night and attempted to capture Roran and Katrina. Though the Razak failed to capture him, they did wound him in the shoulder with their beaks, kidnapping Katrina and escaping atop their parents, the Leatherblacka, with her and Sloane, who was knocked unconscious and taken prisoner when he protested. Roran was utterly devastated by the kidnapping of his betrothed and vowed revenge. Knowing that their position in fighting the soldiers was ultimately untenable, Roran would lead the entire village save for a few that volunteered to remain behind or refused to leave across Allegasia to join the Varden, the resistance fighting Galbatorix and his empire. Along the way, he also learned that his cousin, Aragon, had become a dragon rider and had bonded with the blue dragon Saphira. When he saw this was true for himself at the Battle of the Burning Plains after a 3-month journey leading the villagers to safety against all manner of threats, he realized in that moment that his cousin and his dragon were exactly what he needed to help him rescue Katrina. After the battle had concluded, Roran learned the truth of why his father had died from his cousin, and had told him of what had happened to the village of Carvajal and why Katrina had been kidnapped. By way of scrying, Aragon was able to use magic to show Roran that Katrina was still alive, kept prisoner by the Razak. With the realization that she was indeed alive and, for the time being, unharmed, Roran swore to rescue Katrina from the Razak and Leatherblacka. It took a lot of convincing for Aragon's superior, Nasawada, to grant them the mission of rescuing Katrina, and it was ultimately Saphira herself that explained why it was so important. As long as Katrina was held prisoner, she could be used as a bargaining chip and a hostage to make Roran, and through him Aragon and Saphira, surrender to the king. A situation too dangerous to remain a possibility. As a result, Roran, Aragon, and Saphira were able to mount a rescue mission that was ultimately successful, killing the Razak and Leatherblacka. When Roran finally rescued Katrina, her relief at the fact that he came to rescue her was ultimately the defining moment of the mission. The love that they continued to share in that moment up until their retreat back to the Varden on Saphira's back was also enough to make Aragon slightly jealous with longing, due to the depth of their relationship. Aragon, meanwhile, remained behind to secretly rescue Sloane and punish him for his crimes, something he did out of a desire to spare Katrina the indignity of watching her father be executed. This was a wise move on Aragon's part, as it could have created resentment between Roran and Katrina that might leave them bitter and heartbroken. Roran and Katrina were given a hero's welcome shortly afterward by Nasawada and the other leaders of the Varden when they returned, as tales of Roran's devotion to her were already spreading across the land. As a result, Katrina also became an object of fascination for many amongst the Varden, as they were curious to see what kind of woman could spur a man to undertake such feats in order to rescue the one he loved. Later, Nasawada herself was also generous enough to grant Katrina a dowry from some of the gold, jewels, and other precious objects she could spare, since Katrina had no dowry of her own due to Sloane's disinheritance of her. This gesture also helped her to earn Roran's loyalty, but it also helped to ensure that Roran would be able to provide his future wife with the comforts and protection that she would need in order for them to have a good life. When Aragon returned, Roran asked his cousin to preside over the wedding and unite them in marriage, as he felt Katrina deserved a wedding to remember as the beginning of his way of making up to her for her losing her inheritance. Here, we also learned that the couple wanted to have their wedding as soon as possible, preferably by the end of that week. When Roran explained why, Aragon was elated. Katrina was now pregnant with Roran's child. Aragon agreed, and later that week he united them in matrimony, with their friends Horst and Burgett standing in for Roran's father and Katrina's mother, since both were gone. As part of their marriage, Aragon also presented them with 2 magic rings, which he had constructed from gold he had pulled from the ground with magic. These rings would be able to do several things. They could be used to call Aragon and Saphira for help if either of them was in trouble, and they would always tell Roran and Katrina how to find each other when they were apart or in danger. Saphira also gave the newlyweds her blessings as well. The rest of the evening was dedicated to feasting and celebration, with Roran and Katrina having eyes only for each other, and thus was begun their lives as husband and wife. For the rest of the Varden's campaign, Roran would serve as a soldier, eventually rising to the rank of captain due to his incredible feats of bravery, strategy, and unorthodox tactics. Katrina was supportive of him, but worried for the fate of their unborn baby. In the event of their child being born before Galbatorix was overthrown, Katrina stated that she would leave the army, going to live with some of their fellow villagers in Douth. They eventually agreed to this because they knew the threat that the king represented, and that he would never stop until everyone was under his control, enslaved, or dead. In the event that Galbatorix attacked Douth, Roran also told her to seek out sanctuary with the dwarves, and if that failed, the elves. With this in mind, their plan was set. During this time, Katrina was also very dedicated to her husband's well-being. She also helped him look the part he needed to fulfill and ensured that he was well kept and groomed for when he met with higher commanding officers, including Nasuada herself. When he had disobeyed orders in a battle in the village of Deldorad, Nasuada had ordered him flogged, but likewise promoted him to the aforementioned rank of captain for the fact that he had saved his men from being massacred due to the incompetence of the previous commanding officer, Edric. Roran asked Katrina not to watch him being flogged for the sake of them both, as he would not be able to suffer the indignity of her having to watch him be punished. Roran was in part able to survive the flogging of 50 lashes due to the fact that making sure Katrina could return home to their village safely was his highest priority. Once he had healed, they only remained that much more supportive of one another. In fact, in the aftermath of the siege of Bellatona, Katrina was able to calm and soothe Roran after he had given up on himself in a moment where he had almost died. Likewise, Roran was also incredibly supportive of Katrina in the fact that he was willing to do menial chores most human women in Allegasia were generally assigned or expected to do when she became exhausted or frustrated. Such was this support of her that when she deemed it improper, Roran declared that he did not care what others thought of their relationship or who was doing the work, and promptly convinced her to let him help, using playful threats of carrying her away from her work and forcing her to sit down and be comfortable to convince her to finally relax. Ultimately, they remained supportive of each other even up to the end of the campaign against Galbatorix, with Roran going to great lengths to protect her not only from the king's men on the field of battle, but also from enemies he made amongst the Varden. At one point, just before the final battle at the gates of Urubane, Roran physically threatened the drunken King Orin, the ruler of Surda, who had sent a messenger to the gates of the city. Knowing the foolishness of this, he tried to convince Orin of the danger of doing this, but the king ultimately argued with him until it came to blows, with Roran using his hammer to knock away Orin's sword when the Surdan attacked him. This caused Roran to suggest placing guards around Katrina's tent so that Orin wouldn't be compelled to try and threaten her as a means of manipulating Roran. Thankfully, none of this was needed. Likewise, at the end of the battle when Aragon defeated Galbatorix and killed him, Roran and Katrina were able to relax in peace while awaiting the birth of their child. Eventually, Katrina gave birth to a healthy baby girl, which they named Ismira in honor of her grandmother. Coinciding with this, Roran was later named the Earl of Palancar Valley, where Carvajal and Theransford were located, by extent making both Katrina and the newborn Ismira countesses. With his family now safe, and having risen from being farmers and peasants to becoming nobles, Roran made good on his promise to return home to Carvajal and rebuild. Roughly a year later, the village had been largely rebuilt, and was in the process of raising a small castle, showcasing just how much Roran had done for himself, his family, and his village, and in keeping his promises to the ones he loved most. So, what does all this say about Roran and Katrina? Well, for one thing, theirs could be considered a healthy relationship. At several points within all four books, this can be seen quite clearly. Roran ultimately respects Katrina and values her choices and input, even if he doesn't agree. An example of this is when they are deciding what to do for the safety of their unborn daughter. Though they were lucky enough not to resort to that plan, they were willing to separate for the safety of their baby in the event that the campaign to overthrow Galbatorix failed. It is also worth noting that Katrina was willing to leave her father Sloane because of how much she loved Roran. This, in and of itself, is a very important detail, as she had come to realize how toxic and controlling her father's love had become while at the same time discerning how open and honest Roran's love for her was. This event in the books also showcases that Katrina made a healthy choice in choosing a loving relationship and open communication rather than an unhealthy relationship where she would always be told what to do. While it cannot be understated that Sloane definitely hurt her, it is very clear that Katrina made the right decision both for the sake of her own well-being and that of her positive relationship. Likewise, neither of them could bear to see the other suffer. Katrina was even willing to challenge Nasuwada herself when she learned that Roran was to be punished severely for disobeying orders through flogging. It should be also noted that had Roran not disobeyed these orders, all his men would have been killed, justifying her stance on the issue. She was also willing to stay by his side while he received his punishment, but Roran refused to let her because it would have made it harder for him, as seeing her pain of watching his punishment would be too much for him to bear. All the while he was being flogged, it was his thoughts of Katrina that kept Roran sane and awake. Such was his love for her that it is likely that his thoughts of her saved his life, and kept him conscious long enough to be healed from his wounds. Indeed, whenever Roran went into battle, he often used his thoughts on how much he loved Katrina as a way of shielding his mind from spellcasters and other magicians, showcasing just how important she was to him. Indeed, one of the key aspects of Roran's sheer force of will was that Katrina was always at the forefront of his mind, and that everything he did was ultimately to ensure that she and then later their daughter could be happy and safe. Roran's love for her bordered on obsession at some points, but looking closely at his feelings for her, it should be noted that this was not an unhealthy obsession, but rather a positive one. When it comes to love and romantic relationships, positive and negative obsessions can and sometimes do make or break a relationship. In the case of Roran and Katrina, Roran's positive obsession was centered mostly around keeping Katrina safe and happy, not to mention rescuing her when she was in danger and protecting her from future harm. Roran was willing to go to any length out of love for Katrina. Because of her and his devotion to her, he was willing to traverse the entirety of the land in order to find help in rescuing her after she was kidnapped. That he was ultimately successful further vindicates how dedicated he was as both her lover and then as her husband. Likewise, Roran was willing to do everything he could in order to raise enough money for Katrina to have a good life with him when he initially planned to propose. When an opportunity appeared that could allow him to raise more money in order to support Katrina and their marriage, he was willing to take the opportunity where he could. This is particularly noteworthy because the job he had taken at the time, working in a grinding mill to create flour, was in and of itself quite dangerous, as people often lost their fingers due to the job. That he knew the risks and took the job anyway was a show of just how dedicated he was to ensuring he could provide enough. Later on, when his plans had gone all awry, due to the intervention of Galbatorix's machinations, Roran promised to rebuild his home and by extent the entire village of Carvajal in order to support Katrina. Not only did he pledge himself to this goal, but he ultimately succeeded, showcasing just how dedicated he was to his people and especially the woman he loved. The marital relationship between them was also quite healthy, with respectable boundaries, open communication, and joint decision-making, even if they did not agree on the subject. Like any healthy relationship, they did argue occasionally, which allowed them to work out their problems and gave them room to grow. They even had playful arguments and little fights that only strengthened their bond. One prime example being when Katrina was getting frustrated washing a shirt and Roran volunteering to take over so she could rest. Even when Katrina said it wouldn't be proper for a man to do such work that a woman would normally do, such as washing clothes, her husband disagreed, saying that work was work and it didn't matter who did it. When she further refused to accept this out of fear of what people might say, Roran did not care at all, saying that it didn't matter because he had married her and not someone else who might criticize them. The conversation eventually culminated in playful threats by Roran to carry his exhausted and frustrated wife over to a seat so she could be comfortable while he did the work in her place. That she was amused by this and eventually agreed was a show of just how much Roran loved his wife and wanted to show his support for her, as he was more than willing to help her with whatever she needed when she herself was getting tired and upset, even when it was against the traditions of the time. That was another example of acts that reinforced their relationship. Katrina was also very protective of her husband, and while she is never shown in the books physically protecting Roran, she protects him in other ways, most notably from being overwhelmed or undermined by his own insecurities. When Roran was horrified by the fact that he had nearly died and had in that moment given up on himself when a wall nearly collapsed on him in a battle at Bellatona, Katrina helped him to move past the near-death experience, helping him to remember his reasons to keep going, and helping him move past the fact that he had nearly given up on himself and on protecting their family. Additionally, when their friend Bridget sought blood payment for the death of her husband, Quinby, which was in part due to Roran being pursued by the Razak, though he was not directly responsible for this, Katrina was more than willing to rush to his defense, even as her husband agreed to accept the blood payment. Indeed, it took interference from Aragon, himself being of greater strength than a normal human by that point, to hold her back so that Roran and Bridget could resolve their feud. Ultimately, the blood payment was fulfilled without any loss of life or serious injury, but the fact remained that Katrina was willing to rush to her husband's aid and willing to put herself in harm's way to protect him, just as he had always done for her. It is a brief moment, but an important and poignant one. A moment showcasing just how strong their relationship was and what they were willing to do for one another. So, was this ultimately a good relationship and marriage between these two characters? While maybe not as deeply explored as some other romantic relationships I've read about in other book series, like those in the Empyrean Saga by Rebecca Yarros as an example, I would have to say yes, very much so. Having seen multiple romantic relationships between people I know, including friends and family members, both successful and unsuccessful, I can honestly state that Roran and Katrina indeed have a healthy relationship. Will we get to see more of this relationship in the future? I certainly hope so. I likewise would like to see how the relationship between these characters ultimately evolves in the sequel to Murtagh, as Christopher Paolini has stated that Roran and, by extent, quite possibly, Katrina will be returning for the next book regarding Allegasia. It would certainly be interesting to see how their roles have evolved now that they are parents to a child of their own. It would also be interesting to see how their relationship has evolved and grown since the birth of their daughter in the year between Inheritance and Murtagh. With this in mind, this is where we end our analysis of the relationship between Roran and Katrina, as I feel we have covered the major points, and while there may be a chance I might have missed something, I don't necessarily agree, but you can correct me if I'm wrong by leaving a comment down below this video. If you enjoyed this video, don't be afraid to like, comment, subscribe, and stay tuned for more content like this. Every little bit of appreciation you and other viewers give really helps out the channel. I am thankful for every single one of you who decide to tune in. It is always appreciated. So until next time, thanks again for watching.